Good morning everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to today's session of the NPTEL course Postmodernism in Literature. Today we are looking at two distinct kind of postmodern writings, particularly the novel written by Thomas Pynchon and also the influence of the Beat generation. Though we are looking at these two distinct literary phenomena rather latent to the course, it's important to notice that this hindsight, looking back at the influence of Pynchon and of the Beat literature, is extremely important to understand how relevant their legacy has been in understanding and also in situating and redefining the moments of postmodernism. Thomas Pynchon is an American writer who was born in 1937. He has generally remained as a recluse and shying away from being photographed and also from giving elaborate interviews. There is very little glimpse that we have of his personal biographical details. And it's also been said that Thomas Pynchon is to postmodernism what James Joyce is to modernism, a figure whose writing is unprecedented yet somehow representative of the fiction of a particular age. So, just like James Joyce represents modernism in very peculiar ways, Thomas Pynchon's works also represent postmodern literature in distinctly unique ways. And James Joyce's works have been generally considered extremely difficult for the critic as well as for the readers to understand. And James Joyce himself had boasted of one of his works, Finnegan's Wake, that it would keep the critics busy for another 300 years. And the same could be said about Thomas Pynchon's works as well, because ever since the publication of Pynchon's works, especially his Gravity's Rainbow, it has spawned an entire industry of critics and students trying to decode and understand the things that has been written in the novel. So, it could be in that sense equated with the modernist moment inaugurated by James Joyce. These are some of the important novels by Thomas Pynchon. The novel titled V, The Crying Lot of 49 and A Bleeding Edge, and today we shall be looking at one of his most significant works titled Gravity's Rainbow. And Gravity's Rainbow resembles Ulysses by James Joyce in multiple ways, in terms of its scope, in terms of its ambitious length, and it is also a very difficult read. It's not the kind of novel that one could read for pleasure, rather it is seen more like a task that needs to be completed. If you recall what James Joyce's Ulysses is all about, it is concentrated on a representative day in the life of the protagonist, who is Leopold Bloom. And there is also an ironic parallel that Joyce successfully draws between the protagonist Leopold Bloom and the hero of Homer's Odyssey. And we also find that the James Joyce's novel Ulysses has a number of intertextual references to Homer's Odyssey as well. Gravity's Rainbow, in a rather similar way, focuses on a period of critical importance in modern history, the Second World War, and it talks about the implications of this event and how the world thereafter began to slide into a chaotic state of existence. The title is very significant, Gravity's Rainbow. It could refer to either the parabolic trajectory of a V2 rocket. It's a German rocket, which is also a central image in some of Pynchon's novels, such as V as well as in Gravity's Rainbow. It could also refer to the arc of the plot, which is distinctly similar to that of Joyce's Ulysses. And this novel in that sense could be seen as a novel written in the tradition of Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce and Herman Melville's The Confidence Man. So there are certain modernist trends that we begin to notice in Gravity's Rainbow, but however it becomes very predominantly postmodernist as we begin to analyze and look at particular narrative techniques and devices. The novel Gravity's Rainbow is divided into 4 distinct parts. The first one, Beyond the Zero, has 21 episodes. The second one, with the German title, has 8 episodes. Third one, In the Zone, has 32 episodes, and the fourth one, The Count of Foes, has 12 episodes. It's a rather long, bulky novel, just like Ulysses, with an inherent difficulty to read. The plot structure is rather complex, and it would be rather futile to attempt to give a plot summary in a couple of lines. This complex plot has about 400 characters, and each of them have a different story to tell as well. It is narrated through many different narrative voices, and difficult to keep track of a single narrative voice or a single plot structure which is being unraveled. And this also includes elements of informal self-referential usages, and there are certain instances where we find the novel even breaking the fourth wall. The fourth wall being the invisible division between the audience and the actors on a stage. And it also experiments in terms of its form and its narrative techniques. We find everything being a part of this particular novel, ranging from a movie script to that of a stream of consciousness prose technique. So, written with such kind of a complexity, the novel also demands a second, a third and even multiple readings to make sense of it. And there are a number of study aids which also help us understand and make our way through the novel. Gravity's Rainbow instantly caught the attention of the critics and the readers as soon as it was published, and the New Yorker review had some very significant things to say about Gravity's Rainbow. This excerpt from the review reads, "He is almost a mathematician of prose who calculates the least and the greatest stress each word and line, each pun and ambiguity can bear, and applies his knowledge accordingly and without lapses, though he takes many scary, bracing linguistic risks." These scary linguistic risks also inaugurated the different ways in which postmodern literature began to play incessantly with language. There are certain facts in the novel which are also a part of real history, and many of the things that this novel talks about in terms of the details related to the Second World War, it's also related to the technical documents related to the V2 rockets which were made in Germany. And there's also a reference to a real historical incident which happened in December 1944, where a V2 rocket hit the Rex Cinema in Antwerp, and a set of 1,000 people were watching the cinema then, and about 567 out of them were killed instantly. And this incident is often referred to as the most killed by a single rocket during the entire war period. And the allusions to a number of such historical instances make this novel all the more interesting in terms of its historical significance. There are a number of equations that Pynchon includes in this novel, and it has been verified that most of them are correct. And there are also references to Pavlov, Ouspensky and Jung. They are also based extensively on Pynchon's own research. In Gravity's Rainbow, we find the juxtaposition of different voices, and in fact reading Pynchon is also like being immersed in a constant stream of different voices, which is why it becomes a challenging task for the reader as well as a critic. Wiesenberger's Gravity's Rainbow Companion talks about the different kinds of voices which are part of this novel, and he also differentiates them into formal and informal voices. When he talks about the formal voices, he talks about the influence of various languages such as Hebrew, German, Kazakh, Russian, Spanish, French, Japanese and Herero, and all of these languages, each of these languages are also represented by a specialized jargon. Hebrew is represented through Kabbalistic writings, Russian through the bureaucratic acronyms, and there are lots of conversational puns which are introduced from the French language. Wiesenberg also tells us that there is a mix of informal discourses and popular slang as well. There are references to jokes, song lyrics and street speech. There is ethnic usage of language referring to Black English, and there is also a lot of regional dialects which have found its way into the narrative, both British and American. And the novel also makes use of a lot of military service slang and some esoteric linguistic devices. It refers to astrology, black magic, Freemasonry, etc., and a number of references to folk language, to folk tales. It refers to children's games, and there is also the use of professional jargon from different fields such as cinematography, chemistry and psychology. So here we certainly find that Pynchon revels in the juxtaposition of different voices. It also makes this text rather inaccessible, because we also may need multiple referential points to make sense of different things which are happening within the text. There's also an interconnectedness of different real and fictional events which are weaved together rather wonderfully in this novel. We find the webs of science, technology, politics and history interconnecting. There are also references to wars, the Cold War and also the space race in which most of the advanced countries were participating after the Cold War. And there's also a significant petulant critique of the post-war American society. All of these elements make Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow a rather inaugural moment in understanding and in making sense of postmodern literature. So what exactly makes Pynchon's writings postmodern? Particularly here we are talking about Gravity's Rainbow. In Gravity's Rainbow, we find that there is a certain kind of a crossing over which is being made possible. The text in that sense crosses the border and closes the gap between high culture and low culture. This is also a seminal way in which the novel makes this crossover from being modernist to postmodernist. The approach to narrative, as we have noted, it also makes it very distinctly postmodern and difficult. And there are also a number of characters in the novel who are trying to discern what is going on around them. And unlike the modernist writings where the writer is also in charge of the novel, in charge of the characters, we find that here the characters are left to fend for themselves. They are trying to make sense of the world around them. And what makes this particularly more distinctive and significant is the process through which the reader is also participating in this process. Neither the author, characters nor the reader seems to know what exactly is going on in the narrative scheme. They are constantly in this struggle to make sense of the meaning and make sense of the varied plot structures which are being unraveled at different points of time. There's also an absence of an external reliable perspective which also makes this novel a critique of a single idea of narrative or a single perception of truth. It has often been said about Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow that this is a novel one has to complete, as in finishing a task rather than reading for pleasure. So these are some of the difficulties associated with the reading process that is involved in Gravity's Rainbow. The novel makes use of a complex quest narrative, just like it does in James Joyce's Ulysses. But while in James Joyce's Ulysses one can find a single grand narrative which is being pushed forward, we find that there are multiple quests in Gravity's Rainbow, quite like the modernist text The Sound and the Fury. But the way in which a text like Gravity's Rainbow distinguishes itself as modernist in comparison with the text such as The Sound and the Fury written by William Faulkner is the way in which the reader also becomes a partaker in this quest. While there is a certain mystery to be unraveled and to be resolved in a text like The Sound and the Fury, we find that even this attempt to resolve the mystery, even this quest is rendered futile at the end of it in a text such as The Gravity's Rainbow. We can identify at least two major kinds of quests which are part of this narrative. The first one being led by Tyrone Slothrop, who is also the protagonist of this work. He is trying to find out what was done to him in his infancy when he was handed over to a behaviorist psychologist for experimentation. The second one is led by a number of characters who are also trying to find out what happened at the last launch of a V2, the German rocket, by a rogue German rocket commander. And in addition to this, there is also the reader who is constantly in a quest to find out what exactly is happening in the process of this narration. The connectedness of these quests make this novel all the more postmodern. There is a discovery within the novel, within the plot structure, that everything is connected. So the quest led by Tyrone Slothrop and the many other minor characters, they all merge together at some point. And it is not as if this interconnectedness is the key to resolving the quest, is the key to unraveling the mystery. It only leads to further complications and further futility. And Slothrop can be considered as a descendant of the questing protagonist which Pynchon portrayed in his earlier novels V and The Crying Lot of 49. But however, what makes Gravity's Rainbow all the more difficult is the process through which the principal quest is made the reader. The reader is not just someone who is being told how the quest gets completed or how the mystery is being unraveled, but rather the reader also becomes a participant, a participant in this quest narrative. The narrative and the entire theme gets all the more complicated and complex when we witness the petering out of the quest. Because they all bog down in a proliferation of possibilities and alternatives, and they need not lead to a single resolution. And these quests also are dissolved in ambiguity and uncertainty, and both the protagonist Lothrop and the other characters who are in search of solving the mystery of the V2 rocket, we find that they all lose their way. And this gets echoed in the way the reader approaches this work as well. We find that the readers also lose their way trying to make sense of the various quests and trying to bring them to a sensible conclusion. So why does Pynchon engage in such a long winding process to talk about the unreliability, or rather the instability of this world? And the primary reason is that the instability of the world is something that provoked writers like Pynchon to launch into similar kinds of narratives. And they also considered it their responsibility to talk about worlds which are riddled with sub-worlds and secondary worlds, and also project the possibility of the little enclaves of alternative reality. And theoretically, these are also some of the things that we had taken a look at when we were talking about the postmodern theorists in the earlier sessions. And towards the end, we also find that the entire novel collapses into a war movie in the last page, and without any rhyme or reason, we find this shifting across different kinds of registers, rather usual and rather commonplace within such narratives. And we also realize that this quest for reliable knowledge run aground. And the reliable knowledge, or the idea of knowledge itself, is something which postmodern theorists have been critiquing right from the beginning with Lyotard, who called for an incredulity toward meta-narratives. We realize that the reader also becomes one of the detectives within the novel, and along with the other characters, along with the other detectives, the reader also loses his or her way in the process of reading. It would be rather appropriate to say that a rhizomatic approach is perhaps needed to make sense of such a novel, a rhizomatic approach which we had discussed in the context of the references to Deleuze and Guattari becomes quite useful to engage with text like this, because the novel can be compared more to an encyclopedia or a database and lesser to a linear narrative with a definite kind of progression. And within the novel, history itself is envisioned not as an arborescent, not like a tree-like structure where the branches lead back to the roots, but as a network where any point in time can potentially lead to any other. And this is precisely what Deleuze and Guattari also spoke about when they were talking about a rhizomatic approach which is imminent in the postmodern societies. While Pynchon himself is being celebrated as a kind of a pioneer in this sort of writing and this sort of postmodern techniques, it would be interesting to take a look at some of the elements which influenced a person like Pynchon. Pynchon has revealed very little of himself and his writings through interviews or through his own writings. And what becomes particularly revealing is an introduction that he wrote to one of his later novels, A Slow Learner. And in this introduction, he talks about some of the important movements and some of the important persons that influenced his literary career. I quote from Pynchon's introduction to Slow Learner. At the simplest level, it had to do with language. We were encouraged from many directions, Kerouac and the beat writers, the diction of Saul Bellow in The Adventures of Augie March, emerging voices like that of Herbert Gold and Philip Roth, to see how at least two very distinct kinds of English could be allowed in fiction to coexist. Allowed. It was actually okay to write like this. Who knew? The effect was exciting, liberating, and strongly positive. So here Pynchon talks about some of the major influences in his life, and particularly makes a reference to the beat writers, the beat generation, which was spearheaded by Jack Kerouac. And before we move into a discussion of beat writers, it is important to see the legacy which Thomas Pynchon has left behind. I read to you an excerpt from Brian Nichols' Cambridge Introduction to Postmodern Fiction. Here we also note how Pynchon's narratives came to be recognized as models, particularly in the rendition of postmodern fiction. This is from Brian Nichols' Cambridge Introduction to Postmodern Fiction. Pynchon's novels are packed with narratives, But unlike Ulysses, the paradigmatic modernist novel, these are difficult to treat as one grand narrative. They are densely elusive, yet without an overarching explanatory myth, something that can play the role of the Odyssey in Ulysses. They do not meditate specific intertexts, but large number of intertextual references on an arbitrary basis, picking them up when necessary, leaving them aside once a more appropriate one for the specific point in the narrative is required. More than the work of any other writer, Pynchon's novels have appealed to theorists of the postmodern as parables of how postmodernity puts us in the position of receiving too many signals and dealing with too much meaning. One of the movements which influenced a writer like Pynchon on how to deal with too many signals and too much meaning was certainly the Beat generation. So that makes it rather important to take a look at the Beat generation writers before we wind up this lecture, which is predominantly on Pynchon. And the Beat generation is a movement that influenced the American culture and politics in the post-Second World War era. It was mostly in the 1950s. And the leading figures of the Beat generation were Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg and William S. Burroughs. They are also seen as the important people who in certain ways inaugurated the Beat generation in America and also later began to influence postmodernism in general. And there were also people like Gary Snyder and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who were also part of this movement. And their reputation were mostly as bohemian hedonists, and they celebrated non-conformity and spontaneous creativity. They were also seen as rather objectionable figures in the 1950s and 1960s on account of the bohemian lifestyle and also on account of the ways in which they rejected all kinds of conventions. The term Beat was introduced by Jack Kerouac in 1948. This referred to an anti-conformist youth movement which had originated in New York, and the colloquial meaning of the word then included terms just tired and beaten down. They were from the African American origin, and there were also expressions such as beat to his socks, which again referred to being totally beaten down. But however, what Kerouac and his companions did was they altered and appropriated this term beat to mean new things, to mean upbeat, and also introduced terms such as beatific. So beat then began to signify more radical things, and also it becomes synonymous to defying all kinds of conventions and talking about things which are taboo. So, Howl, the poem published in 1956, it was initially read out as a performance poem. This even marked the beginning of the Beat movement, and the poem Howl by Allen Ginsberg also had led to an obscenity trial in 1957. This also had catapulted the Beat generation to an international fame and reputation. And the obscenity trial was on account of the references to illicit drugs and sexual practices. The entire set of events were again depicted in a 2010 film titled Howl. So, I read to you an excerpt from the beginning of the poem Howl, and here we also see how Allen Ginsberg inaugurated a certain generation which would know how to radically defy all conventions of writing and also defy all conventions of existing notions of societal morality. This is from Howl, Allen Ginsberg's poem. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving hysterical naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night, who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water, flats floating across the tops of cities contemplating jazz, who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenements' roofs illuminated, who passed through universities with radiant cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake-like tragedy among the scholars of war, who were expelled from the academics for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull, who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in waste baskets and listening to their terror through the wall. This is the beginning of the poem. Then there were many radical things that the poem spoke about, leading for the text to be banned in different parts of the world. But of course, it was much later that they began to realize the significance of these kinds of writings and how it was important, how these counterculture movements were important to identify and critique what was happening in post-war American society. The other significant event, part of beat literature, part of beat generation, was Burroughs' publication of his novel Naked Lunch in 1959. Naked Lunch was fashioned as a series of loosely connected episodes. It was like bringing together of a cut-up or a collage. This was made from pieced together sentences from different works, and many thought that was very interesting to begin with. And the chapters, he himself announced that the chapters were intended to be read in any order, like a hypertext fiction of the contemporary. And the Naked Lunch literally meant a frozen moment when everyone sees what is on the end of every fork, just like Howl by Allen Ginsberg. This 1959 novel by Burroughs also had to face a number of censorship battles. There were obscenity charges against the work. This was banned in 1962 in Boston, and however the decision was revoked, and it was found to have some social value in 1966. Jack Kerouac's On the Road was another significant work that influenced the beat literature and also the American postmodern literature in the later decades. On the Road was based on the travels of Kerouac and his friends across the United States, and this has been considered as a very defining work of post-war beat and counterculture generations. Jack Kerouac is also considered as a forefather of postmodern literature. So it's through them that writers such as Pynchon, they began to realize that language can be a means to experiment with, and language can also be used to defy all kinds of conventions and the kinds of moral tendencies which were prevalent in particular societies. And this is what New York Times had to say when Jack Kerouac brought out his work On the Road. It's the most beautifully executed, the clearest and the most important utterance yet made by the generation Kerouac himself named years ago as beat, and whose principal avatar he is. So what did the beat generation do? How did these writers come to contribute significantly to the postmodern moment? They wrote about everything, and especially about whatever was taboo, and this was something which was precisely needed in the decades which succeeded the modernist movement, and also in the decades which succeeded the progress of modernity. They also wanted to dismantle the modern society in whichever ways that they could, and this was primarily done through their own lifestyle and through their writings. They also critiqued the madness of society's constraints. We find that all of these elements put together, they also form the crux of much of postmodern theories and much of postmodern literature. As I begin to wrap up this lecture, I leave you with a quote which talks about the legacy of the beat generation, and this excerpt also captures rather succinctly what not just beat generation but also the entire set of the postmodern writers had been doing to the contemporary. The beat generation made a lasting impact on the structure of modern American society. With Ginsberg's Howl, the notion of what was acceptable literature was broadened immensely. Censorship as a force for modulating public discourse in the realm of literature at least came to an end. Perhaps more importantly, the beats propelled discussions of ecology and environmentalism into the mainstream. Before the 1950s, environmentalism as it is understood today did not really exist. The beat generation's infatuation with Native American and Eastern philosophies contributed to the genesis of modern environmental ethics, at least as a byproduct. Modern poetry underwent a relaxation of structure and style that basically allowed for anyone to express in whatever fashion they chose. Experimentation became an expectation, as the stuffy formalism of the moderns was wholly subverted. Some of the things that the beats managed to do became a yardstick and became an event that opened the floodgates of postmodernism in the later decades. They challenged the structure of society, they challenged acceptable notions of literature, they also redefined the notions related to censorship, and finally they also made it possible for experimentation to be an expected thing in the field of literature. On this note, we also begin to wrap up today's discussion. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.